Hey everybody, and welcome back to the show. As you can see behind me, we are in our Dallas studios today. And one of the things that you hear about Dallas and Texas is things like power demands and energy infrastructure and data centers. But it's not unique to us just here in Texas, even though a lot of those conversations happen just due to proximity. But as we continue to expand in the world of technology, the demand for power becomes higher. You look at data center demand for AI capabilities, demand for ESG requirements. The power draw and demand for that is excruciatingly high and stresses our current power systems really more than we even probably expected it to. And I want to talk a little bit more about that conversation today and how a lot of critical infrastructure and even corporations are leveraging new technologies and opportunities from a power standpoint to help fight some of that. So I've got Aron Bowman on, president of ELM Microgrid Solar. Aron, thanks for coming in today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Ben.
Well, of course, Aron, so I want to ask, a lot of our audience probably skews a little bit more technical, right? So doesn't always have to have the day-to-day conversation from hey, how am I managing and storing power? Some of those folks are, right? Because there's some natural crossover. So I want to ask kind of as the first question, I think that there's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of different conversations and ESG and all these different things. From a commercial power infrastructure standpoint, where sort of are we right now? What does that look like?
I think what we're seeing, Ben, is that a lot of companies are trying to roadmap that out and figure out where that goes. And it's not just, they have to not only work amongst what they need as far as a major energy source, say a data center in an area, but they have to actually work in conjunction with their local utility and with technology providers such as ourselves to kind of all work hand in hand to figure out what does a holistic solution look like to get them where they need to go for their goals, and then map that out for the next 5, 10, even 15 years. I was on a call yesterday for a working group I'm on in New York City, actually, and we had a array of different groups on looking at not only end users, so we had building representatives and some data center representatives and things like that. We had folks from Con Edison, the utility there, myself and a few other groups from a technology perspective. We were all kind of trying to work to lay out what does this roadmap look like? And we're seeing that here in the Dallas area as well. That demand is growing here, and we're working with groups where they're saying, hey, we're seeing that we're going to be building faster than what the grid can support us. What do we do? A lot of it right now is starting to look at what's the technology available and how do I blend that in with what's available for my energy resources for a roadmap out 3, 5, 10 years from now, as well as I need this immediate solution right now.
Well, it's interesting because the burden not only falls on the utility and energy providers for us locally here, it's Encore, but it applies pretty dramatically to building operators and managers and construction facilities, because if you don't have that infrastructure at the pre-build standpoint, it's very hard to retrofit something to triple, 3, 4x your pipe from an energy consumption standpoint. How early do those conversations have to happen? Is it total new build? It's got to be done at the beginning, or do those retrofit conversations happen a little bit?
Both happen. Obviously, if we can get in a conversation on new build, it's a little easier to get the grid infrastructure there from the beginning, but you still have the limitations of what's available in that specific region from that substation or group of substations in that region and what the utility can get from a power perspective. So we have a lot of conversations where we're talking to people about future expansion. But then from a microgrid standpoint, that's where we can really come in and help identify what we could do to enhance the existing grid infrastructure that's there, because we can come in and add additional power capability through solar and energy storage to enhance the existing grid infrastructure. And there's a lot of different ways you can attack that, both grid tied and even taking a portion of the building off grid sometimes.
Well, I want to ask, you said microgrid, obviously that's in the name of the company, right? That means different things to different people, and I think it's fair to acknowledge that.
Sure.
When you say microgrid, how would you define that in this context?
Sure, in this context, what we define a microgrid is a system that we really focus on renewable energy microgrids. So solar or wind source for a generating source on site with energy storage component that has a intelligent control system that can manage interacting between the grid available power, the generated power on site, and a way to store and manage that so it can be called upon demand. And that can even include, and quite often does include, even other on-site like fossil fuel generation sources, whether it be a a natural gas generator, a diesel generator. We have systems even interconnected with CHP systems, and then working to optimize all that to get the end customer what they need, but in a method that they don't even know it's happening, right? It happens, smooth transitions, very intelligently controlled. Our definition of a microgrid is an intelligent on-site generation source that is handling either a building or a group of buildings, or even at times when we're working with utilities, even sections of the utility where they want to isolate portions to be able to handle their customer loads for their end customers' usage. And we have all those arrays of applications that we've done across the country.
Yeah, what's interesting really about a lot of the microgrid technology is it's designed not only for some of those on-grid capabilities, but off, right? You know, we see it from time to time, especially being here in Texas where we've got hurricanes, and heaven forbid we talk about ERCOT on this show, but the failure of the grid a number of years ago. When you talk about kind of this coalition of on-grid, off-grid, microgrid, solar, battery storage technologies, you know, one of the places that comes to my mind immediately is data centers, right? And it's sort of the topic du jour because you've got AI, you've got all this data management, cloud storage that's happening. It's something that we deal with pretty regularly here in Texas as well. I'm going to stop saying Texas one of these days, but it's ironic because we're sort of a microcosm of the larger energy consumption space. But how is that being leveraged in the world of data centers, right? Because at this point, data centers really are becoming critical infrastructure because you've got patient data, you've got utility data. Obviously, you're keeping all sorts of just cloud storage systems up. But how are data centers specifically leveraging a lot of these technologies?
Well, what we've seen traditionally, data centers have had a lot of like generators on site to provide that backup power and resiliency in case that goes down. But with the ESG goals that are now coming in, they have to look at, well, how do I integrate renewables? How do I have a better controlled system? So we're doing a lot of work. We have some great partners in the data center space actually that do a lot of that traditional construction and development of those energy systems for data centers. So we're working hand in hand with them on integrating how we can integrate the microgrid features into that with to enhance the usage of those traditional energy generation sources on site. So it's a lot of people want to go to an or is it fossil-based energy or is it renewable? And you get people on both sides very strongly, especially here in Texas. You get people that are very into renewables, and you get people that are very strong onto fossils. But we really believe it's more of a philosophy of an and, because ultimately what you want to have is the best solution. And that best solution a lot of times is integrating multiple of those components together. So in a data center instance, it might be a solution where we say, hey, we can do some things with some natural gas generators that are going to be low impact on the environment as far as their generating capacity compared to maybe a diesel generator. But then integrate in renewables, so solar. A lot of times data centers have a nice big roof that you can work with to get a lot of solar, but solar is very inconsistent, right? A cloud comes over, you're running at 100%, and a cloud comes over and all of a sudden you drop down to 10%. And that has a big impact swing on things like your demand charges from the utility and those types of issues with your electric bill, as well as if you're running on generator. But by integrating an energy storage component with batteries and an intelligent control, you can mitigate those issues, smooth out the impact to both the grid, to generating source like a generator, natural gas generator, which doesn't like to see a lot of fluctuation on the loads that hit the generator. But then also optimize your solar usage. So you can say, I can crank that solar, and even if I'm generating more solar power than I'm needing to use, I can store it, do a time of use shifting with it later, and kind of optimize that. You can also, with the energy storage system, potentially take advantage of time of use shifting of your price of electricity from the grid. So you could look at taking when demands are high running on the data center, you can offset that with energy that's stored, that maybe was stored from the batteries even overnight, not from solar, but was stored in the grid overnight and used because you have a time of use shift pricing. We see that a lot in California, but it's making its way here. And also it helps you manage demand charges, which we get hit with quite a bit here in Texas, and the ability to trim those. So when you start to look at it from a data center perspective, or any business, but data centers especially, you kind of start value stacking these items. So everybody always asks me, well, what's the one thing people buy? And the answer is, well, there's usually one primary driver. There's this one primary driver that says this is why we want to look at this. But then the real decision comes down to a stack of values that include perhaps some corporate ESG goals, a look at what the return on investment is, what's the long-term IRR on this situation, as well as what's the upfront cost and CapEx and those sort of things. So it's always, it starts with one objective usually that kind of drives the conversation, but the ultimate answer gets into a combined solution that value stacks these things together and comes up with ultimately the best balance of all these potential pieces of the puzzle.
Well, I want to put a pin in solar, and I'm going to ask you about it here in just a second. But you talk about ESG requirements. I think that as we look at resilient technologies and resilient energy and backups and things like that, not just even specifically resilient, you talk about sustainability, environmental goals, things like that. That has found its way into a lot of different verticals, right? I think the two easy ones that come to my mind, we talk about data centers, but even places like hospitals and utilities, things like that. But what are some of those other verticals where you're seeing a lot of growth from an energy management and storage standpoint?
Well, one area we're seeing a lot of growth right now is in actually in schools, school districts, more from a resiliency standpoint, because they're looking at, they could be a resiliency center for the community in a natural disaster, but they also have ESG goals, right? These school districts have ESG goals just like a hospital does, or a data center does, or things like that. And it's layered because it's not only a lot of times tied to what they want to achieve, but it's also tied to things like their federal funds available and these sort of things. So school districts is an area. Hospitals definitely is a growing area that we see more and more. We just had a system go into a hospital in Boston that is going online here in about another 2 weeks out in Boston. We have systems for factories. We have a big system going into a factory in Chicago, major automotive manufacturer. And so, ESG goals at the corporate level, but it's also part of a broader ESG perspective, right? So they're not only putting in energy storage and solar, but it's tied in with a program where they're, putting in LED lighting throughout the plants, and they're putting in more efficient HVAC systems, right? So, it gets wrapped into these larger goals that both drive cost savings, but also achieve ESG goals for stakeholders.
I love that you mentioned kind of the education piece sort of being a safe house, right? And I'm curious if a lot of these corporations and places like data centers and energy resilient spaces are trickling that down to the community, right? Are there examples where you're seeing folks, repurpose or leverage technology to maybe better support the community specifically, or is it more just sort of siloed?
We have seen some instances, especially when you start working with like the utilities, where we have some instances with some of the utilities where they're working on projects where they're putting in a microgrid, say at a university campus, or talking to a major manufacturing facility or one of these data centers where they're saying, hey, the utility wants to come in and partner with you, drop in this energy storage so we can give you this resiliency solution, but we want to use your facility, your location to drop this unit in, but then we're going to build a microgrid that expands out beyond the borders of your facility to support the surrounding neighborhood. And then they're putting isolators in and saying, okay, well, we can not only support you, but then we can leverage this to support the greater community. So there is some instances of that we're seeing. A lot of times that's, like I said, that's some great examples of, we're really seeing utilities start to think outside the box. I think we're still growing into that here a little bit in the middle of the country, like Texas and things like that. But the utilities we're working with out on the coast, and I'm not just talking about California, so everybody gets all worked up about that. But, like I'm talking like up in Washington, Oregon, out on the East Coast, Northeast and things like that, where they're really, really getting stressed on the grid. Some of these utilities are doing a great job of starting to say, hey, we can't just be have this isolated wall between us and the end customer. We got to start to figure out how to bridge these gaps. And so there's some really interesting projects going on where it's a blend of the utility might bring in the energy storage, but then the end customer is put in solar. So they have the renewable generation asset and the utilities tied in the storage. So it's like a mix of behind the meter and in front of the meter where you're optimizing that for not only the customer, the single end customer like the factory, but then also the surrounding area as well. So we are starting to see some progression in that, and people are realizing that this is not just, everybody has to kind of come together to solve this issue because they're looking down the road and saying the energy demand is not slowing down. No matter what side of the aisle you're on when you get into the politics of renewables and that sort of thing, the truth of the matter is, regardless of what happens in November, the energy demand is not going to slow down. That's going to keep growing. We need every energy generating asset and every energy solution that we can muster to solve this challenge. And it's a solution based problem that we need to solve.
Well, it is interesting that we talk about that community piece, how much of that conversation seems to be driven by folks at the end of the line. Probably most of the time in the residential side of things where they're talking about, I want to put up solar, I want to put up this. But a lot of that is driven, I think, from misconceptions, right? Because, we've talked about solar a few times too, and I think that people just assume, look, the only way I can generate power is I got to stick up a windmill or I got to put an eyesore of a solar panel on my house. The reality is, especially when you start to get into commercial and larger infrastructure applications, the conversation's far more nuanced, right? There's thermal technologies. There's a lot of different ways that you can generate power. What are some of those ways maybe that people haven't had the conversation at scale yet that maybe should be coming to the forefront a little bit?
Yeah, I think one big area you mentioned briefly there is the thermal. We're working with a group called Naked Energy, which has a product called Virtue, that we're bringing to the U.S. that tackles the thermal loads. And what people don't realize is 50% of the energy in the world is used for thermal, is used for heating, whether it be process heat at a factory, whether it be heating hot water, whether it be heating buildings. We all think of electricity demand, but there's a lot of that's used to convert to thermal. And what we've found is this solution in the same footprint as traditional PV, we get 3 to 4 times the energy production in thermal at a site. So you talked about hospitals earlier. We've got a string of hospitals that we're working with right now that have huge thermal loads, as you can imagine, right? They're constantly using hot water, doing a lot of laundry, needing to, sterilize things. And a lot of their energy demand is thermal, and they have a huge ESG goal to try and get their loads down for these sites. Well, we came in and we looked at the rooftop and said, well, we can get you almost 4 times the energy on this rooftop with thermal and still do some things to tie in PV as well. So what's exciting about that is the Naked Energy solution has a solution called PVT, which is a PV plus thermal all combined in one solution. And with traditional PV, you're only maybe using about 20% of the sun's energy because a lot of it's just rejected in heat. That's a standard PV panel. With this solution, we're using almost 90% of the sun's energy because we're capturing the thermal and using that to create heat, but then also still capturing the PV, the electricity factor of that as well. So it's pretty exciting. Really what we try to look at is what can we do to achieve the end goal? So whether it's traditional PV, whether it's a solar thermal solution, whether it's a blend of those two, add in energy storage. And then even as I talked about, like what you were saying is everybody just thinks I got to slap a bunch of solar panels up and do this. We have customers that have just put in the energy storage because they realize that there's a lot of electricity they're not using at night that their utilities are actually encouraging them to use, right? Utilities have to generate this base load no matter what. And at night when load's low in a lot of areas, they need somewhere for that energy to go. So they're really encouraging their customers to use that. So even that leads to the overall efficiency of the grid. So we do have applications and utility customers that just put in energy storage because it helps with the efficiency, because then they don't have to try and crank up those generating sources later on in the middle of the day when there's more energy demand or when everybody gets home from work. So we see a lot of different applications, and I think the biggest thing is for people to not get pigeonholed into it's one solution. That's not the reality of it. Like you said, it's nuanced and every situation is a little different. And what you have to have, though, is standardized products and solutions that are flexible enough to achieve the goals. What you don't want is for every one of these things to be a science project. When we first came into the industry 10 years ago, we started out, we were just going to do the controls, just the software, the intelligent controls, and that's what we started doing. And then what we realized, though, was every site was a new science project, and there was new things to figure it out. We realized that what we needed to do is really standardize these solutions, and we kind of refer to them as like Lego blocks, right? Here's an array of Lego blocks we have, and you can do a mix and match of those to build exactly what you need for your solution. And what we found is that can really get about 95% of the sites that customers have. You can use our Lego blocks and get there, right? And there's others like that in the industry as well. But that's really what we've got to continue to do. Is the industry like us needs to drive these solutions that give the flexibility to address all these different applications, whether it's a small to medium sized business, all the way up to a big factory, all the way up to a full community like this. So we've got systems that range from, we've got sites with 125 kW that's on a site in New Orleans. That's a community resiliency center. There's actually 3 of those now. There's quite a few more we're going to tackle. But one's a school. It's not a Boys and Girls Club, but it's something like a Boys and Girls Club in a community. And one's a church. And they've put those in, and those are resiliency systems that are helping manage those sites' energy costs, but also in an outage situation, which we've already experienced one of those, that the facility can be a resiliency center, a place where the lights are on and they can come and power their cell phones, and they can come and get a hot meal and all these sort of things for the community. But then ranging up to large systems going into substations to support utilities that are concerned that that substation is going to get a lot of demand from EV chargers going into everyone's home in a community, and that the substation can't handle that demand, so they're putting in energy storage to buffer that, to factories and hospitals like we talked about. So there's a lot of different applications, and you have to have the scale and breadth of products, but have them in a way that are consistent and repeatable and easy to adopt.
I'm curious, you talk about a lot of different applications, everything from the small and medium business up to the enterprise and even the school and municipal level. Where do a lot of those conversations start? Is it somebody typically who's an owner of ESG? Is it a facilities manager? Is it your CFO saying we got to slash how much we're spending on energy? How do those conversations normally start?
I would say yes. But it really starts, the reason it's a yes is because sometimes it is at the finance level. They're looking at it saying, holy cow, we're getting our butts kicked with this utility bill every month, and 70% of the bill is these demand charges. What do we do about that, right? Other times it's a corporate goal, so it's ESG, but other times it's operations saying, we've got to expand the operations here and I can't get enough power. So really we see that breadth of starters for that conversation. One thing we try to do too is we try to be very active in as many communities as we're participating, and even at the federal level with a lot of different organizations that are trying to help drive these change. So it's interesting. There's these working groups that we're a part of where we find different levels to start the conversation. So utilities, that's a big area where we focus on. And it's interesting sometimes because you get into the co-op regions with some of these smaller utilities, and they will take us to, say, a manufacturing plant and say, I can't solve this problem for them, but I think you guys could. So they'll enter that conversation in. So, generally, ESG is definitely a great area to start. If there's an organization that has an ESG lead, that's always a good conversation starter. But finance isn't a bad area. They're going to get involved at some point, right? So I'd say most common is probably ESG or operations, trying to drive a demand issue or a resiliency issue, and then it flows into the finance side of things. So at the same time, some of it is driven by, public policies. EV is a huge driver right now of the energy demand of what's going on. And it's not, again, get out of the politics of it. There's a lot of value that organizations are seeing going to an EV fleet from a manageability standpoint, from a uptime standpoint, from a service cost standpoint, life of the vehicle, but then also getting into meeting their ESG goals, and then also the predictability of the cost of electricity versus gas that can fluctuate prices, over the course of a year. And you've got something you can look out and say, well, I know electricity is going to be this cost for the next 3 years. I know this is what it's going to cost to fuel my fleet, but then how do I get enough energy to do that? So there's a lot of different areas where that conversation starts. But yeah, I would say most common is either from an ESG group within a big corporation or operations within a smaller to mid-sized business that's trying to figure out how the heck do I solve this problem?
Well, right? That's the next follow-up is how do people start, right? I mean, is it as simple as picking up the phone and calling and saying, look, here's my problem, can you help me figure it out? Or is it something a little bit more formal?
We like that, actually. We get that a lot, especially that's kind of one of our niche areas in the industry, is that we are the guys that people come to with challenges. We've got one group we're working with right now that came to us and said, hey, we want to put a system on the telescope array in Chile that's at 17,000 feet in the air, and it's running on diesel generators nonstop right now, and we want to figure out how to get this on renewable. But there's nobody in the world that offers an energy storage system that can operate here. Do you guys think you could look at this? And we're looking at it, and we think we have a solution for them on that. At the same time, we have a lot of times where customers call and say, I've got this challenge. What's this look like? Or they call and they have a preconceived notion, like you were talking about. Hey, I need to do this with solar and battery. And we'll take a look and we'll respond and say, here's what that would look like. But also, here's some things we've done from another customer that's very similar to you. So we try to kind of add that service to our customers. We've got a whole team of people that have seen a lot of different applications across not only the country. We've done a lot in the Caribbean. We're starting to get into Central and South America. We've done things in Canada. We've got a system all the way out on the island of American Samoa with the military. So we've done military applications. It goes all the way from very formal, like people have really researched it and have it together, but also we have people that just pick up the phone and call and say, I've got this problem. It seems like maybe you guys could help. And we're always happy to jump in there as well. So, however we can get to providing that solution, we're happy to start there.
Well, it's a good place to be when people are picking up the phone and calling you, right? That's sort of a business dream right there. And Aron, I want to give you the last word here. I always love to wrap up with this question. If you had a crystal ball, and you said in the next 5 to 10 years, here's where the industry is going to go, what would you say? Is it new technologies? Is it more scalability? Is it more options for renewables? Where would you say the industry is moving towards?
I think it's a blend of continued scalability. There are new technologies, but I always think that's going to be an evolution because everybody gets excited about new technology, but then the reality of it is you got to get it to a point where it's bankable and repeatable. And, people want these things with 15 and 20 and 25-year warranties, right? And, you can't just roll out a hot new technology and feel comfortable that you can do that, right? So it's got to be an evolution of technology. But then constantly working to make the current technology more scalable, easier to adopt. The biggest push is we need to continue to work to make this go faster. And that's a blend of both the technology, but also things like the permitting process and the approval process, and having utilities comfortable with the technologies out there so they'll approve it faster, having municipalities understand what they're approving better. So there's a lot of education that needs to continue to happen with not only from the industry, but out to the people that are going to be doing the final sign off that this is approved to go into my community or to go onto my grid and those sort of things. So I think from a crystal ball perspective is that we continue to find ways to speed up that process of getting these systems in the field and up and running for people.
Well, Aron, I'll tell you what, it's been fantastic to have you in, and I loved really just your willingness to share the insight, right? Because people like me who live throughout different tangents of the industry, we don't always know the nuts and bolts behind everything, right? Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's a great thing, but sometimes it's an opportunity to educate, right? And I love being able to ask questions to people that are willing to share their expertise with the industry. So thank you so much for coming in and joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and really enjoy everything you guys do to help push the market forward. So it's mutual as far as the enjoyment. So.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all for tuning in and joining us today. We hope you stay tuned for our next episode. Like and subscribe. Be sure to check us out next time.